A year went by. It was winter again, and a day of lowering sky. Richard and Charlie Mason were on top of Mesa Verde tracking strays that had wandered off with a bunch of wild cattle. The men had reached the summit after driving their horses across the icy river and then up the precipitous switchback climb between Navajo and Chaco Canyons. Now, following the tracks, they found themselves in a place where neither had been before. It was snowing, large drifting flakes that blurred their vision. Making progress more difficult, a barrier of underbrush scratched and snared the legs of their panting horses. The cattle tracks fanned out or narrowed according to the terrain, sometimes taking the riders closer than they liked to the edge of the abyss. It was December 18th, 1888. Richard and Mason dismounted to rest the horses at a place overlooking a small branch canyon, then walked out in the wind-swept point of bare rock. The gulf yawning below them was so deep that dislodged stone would have plummeted down and struck at last without audible echo. A snow-powdered dark green carpet of treetops ascended the bottom of the gorge into a wider distant canyon. Suddenly, with an exclamation of astonishment, Richard grasped Mason's arm. Nearly opposite them, half a mile away and just below the far mesa's brown caprock, was a long, deep opening in the cliff face, mirage-like in the falling snow, and outlined against the cave's darkest shadows were ghostly traceries of the largest cliff dwelling either of them had ever seen. The walls rose and fell in broken terraces, pierced here and there by the black, sightless eyes of doorways. Near the center, rising austerely in the afternoon's pale light, a tapering tower of 3 stories, beautifully round, dominated the entire ruin. It was all as complete and unreal as a crenellated castle. The strays were forgotten. Richard and Charlie Mason turned away and started back around the edge of the smaller canyon, keeping the horses as close to the rim as they dared. They broke a fresh trail through the underbrush until they reached a clearing directly opposite the great cave. Here, the cliff dropped away abruptly for 30 feet or more, but the problem of descent was quickly solved. Finding several dead trees, they lopped off the limbs to within a foot or so of the trunks, joined the sections together with their lariats, and then lowered the whole improvised ladder over the cliff. By this means, they reached the bottom. Now, standing in the silence of the rim, they could begin to gauge its height. The walls rose in tumbled splendor above them for several levels, and, to the height of a tall pine, reached into the shadows beyond the round tower for 200 or 300 yards. The cabin they had left in the morning could be tucked away into a corner of this crowded cave. They moved, scarcely speaking, but their voices magnified in the hollow echoes across piles of rubble. Behind them, from one room to the next, they left footprints in the dust for centuries undisturbed by any human. Then, or soon afterwards, Richard thought of the name Cliff Palace. Nothing else would quite do. For several hours, he and Charlie Mason explored the ruins with mounting excitement, with the realization they had discovered a prehistoric wonder of architecture undreamed of by their world. 400 people or more once lived there, and when they left, they took only light possessions that could be carried easily. In the feathery dust of one room, the explorers found a stone axe. The heavy blade still lashed securely to a wooden handle. In other rooms were pottery bowls, mugs, and a large jar for cooking or carrying water, left as though the owners had just set them down and might return at any moment. The thought occurred, whoever they were, these people had fled after a siege, and there was some evidence to support this idea. Roof beams had been pulled out of almost all of the rooms, and not a trace of the timbers remained. What could this mean, they reasoned? That the attackers had attempted to destroy the village after overcoming its defenders? On the other hand, there was little else to suggest there had been siege and violence. They did discover 3 skeletons in the rubble. After a battle, was that enough? They left the skeletons as they had found them, but took a few pieces of pottery, eager now to discover if other large ruins were close by. Snow still fell over the mesa, and, with not too many hours of daylight left, they separated after agreeing to meet and camp near the place where they had first seen Cliff Palace. Dusk closed in, and they met, first gathering and piling pinon branches for a fire against the oncoming cold. Then, stamping in the snow and flailing his arms over the ruddy glow, Charlie Mason would report nothing more than his nearly frozen hands and feet. But Richard had been luckier. He told of another ruin he'd found in the late afternoon, not as large as Cliff Palace, but in better condition. After they parted, Richard said. He rode north and then west across the mesa, emerging finally on the rim of the deep canyon. Following its curve, he sighted a second large cave, and within it a cave dwelling rising in places to 3 stories. The light was darkening. Across the front of the cave was a fringe of spruce trees clinging to a steep slope. One of these, a tree of great height, had sprouted up through the outer retaining wall, and for this reason Richard named the ruin Spruce Tree House. When morning came, and they started back for Spruce Tree House, they lost their way and presently came to the edge of Navajo Canyon. There, almost at their feet, was a third large cliff dwelling. Richard named it Square Tower House. Built in curving recess at the base of the cliff, it was smaller than Spruce Tree House, but remarkable for the square tower thrusting 4 stories high among a cluster of rooms and circular chambers. They inspected it hurriedly and then went on, finding several small ruins in the same vicinity before deciding, after measuring the dwindling supply of food, to turn back toward winter camp in Johnson Canyon. On their return, they encountered the camp of 3 acquaintances, Charles McLeod, Howard Graham, and Levi Patrick. Richard and Mason stopped long enough for some warming coffee, while Richard drew a rough map in the snow showing where they had found Cliff Palace. When he finished, the listening men were determined to see it for themselves. They waited only long enough to be joined by John Wetherill. The 4 of them packed in on foot with enough food to last several days, while Richard and Charlie Mason continued toward the cabin. A short time after the McLeod party returned, the men combined forces for a systematic search, not only of Cliff Palace, but of any other ruins they could find in Mesa Verde. For Richard, it was a turning point in his life. Before this, exploring had been a pastime. Now it had become a passion that consumed his time, his energy, and all of his resources. He had discovered a lost civilization. Many writers have described Cliff Palace, but no one has succeeded so well as Willa Cather, who from Richard Wetherill drew a major character for her novel The Professor's House, where he appeared as Tom Outland. Miss Cather never met Richard Wetherill. He had been dead 5 years when she visited Mesa Verde, but from one of his brothers she had heard how he and Charlie Mason had found Cliff Palace in 1888. Mason also appears in her novel as Roddy Blake, but even more than Tom Outland, he is a character of her imagination. Miss Cather chose to leave Roddy Blake behind on the day when Tom Outland alone discovered the ruin. In stopping to take a breath, I happened to glaze up at the canyon wall. I wish I could tell you what I saw there, just as I saw it on that first morning through a veil of lightly falling snow. Far up above me, 1,000 feet or so, set in a great cavern in a cliff, I saw a little city of stone, asleep. It was as still as sculpture, or something like that. It all hung together, seemed to have a kind of composition. Pale little houses of stone nestling close to one another, perched on top of each other, with flat roofs, narrow windows, straight walls, and in the middle of this group a round tower. It was beautifully proportioned, that tower, swelling out to a larger girth a little above the base, and then growing slender again. There was something symmetrical and powerful about the swell of the masonry. The tower was a fine thing that held all the jumble of houses together and made them mean something. It was red in color, even on that gray day. In sunlight it was the color of winter oak leaves. A fringe of cedars grew along the edge of the cavern like a garden. They were the only living things. Such silence and stillness and repose immortal with the calmness of eternity. The falling snowflakes sprinkling the piñons gave it a special kind of solemnity. It was more like a sculpture than anything else. I knew at once that I'd come upon a city of some extinct civilization, hidden away in this inaccessible mesa for centuries, preserved by the dry air and almost perpetual sunlight, like a fly in amber, guarded by the cliffs, the river, and the desert. In one particular, the impressions made upon the minds of Al Wetherill in 1887 and of the fictional Tom Outland are the same. Both caught their first glimpse of the ruin from the depths of Cliff Canyon. By having it so in the case of Outland, Miss Cather may have been responding less to literary device than to her memory of an unusual personal experience. Miss Cather's most lasting impression of Cliff Palace came from seeing the ruin accidentally, and as few have, bathed in moonlight at 2 o'clock in the morning.
at New York City. Get me to the fun.